The most wanted gunslinger in 3 territories rode up to a lone mountain cabin and found a Japanese woman kneeling beside her stove, grinding herbs like the place was a temple, and he was the intruder. He'd drawn on 100 men without flinching, but she looked at the blood on his coat instead of the revolver on his hip, and something in him stalled. What he did that afternoon is the kind of thing a man like him was never supposed to do, and it cost him more than any shootout ever had. Before the day was over, he'd understand why she was alone at the edge of the world, and she'd understand why a man with his name couldn't walk away. Stay until the end to see how a woman trained in the old ways of Japan turned the deadliest man in the territory into the one thing he never thought he'd become. And if it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. Blaze rode into the Wolf Creek Valley on the back end of a 3-day fever, trailing a wound in his side that had gone from sore to angry to dangerous somewhere around the second river crossing. He'd taken the Grays in a mining camp above the pass, a disagreement over a card hand that turned into a disagreement over a rifle, and he'd left the other man in the dirt and ridden out before the camp decided what it wanted to do about it. That was 3 days and 2 rivers ago, and the wound had been talking to him louder with every mile, a low, hot voice that said he didn't have long before the riding stopped mattering. The wound was winning. He wasn't looking for people. People were the thing he had the most of and wanted the least, because people meant witnesses, and witnesses meant warrants, and warrants meant the kind of hanging that didn't wait for a judge. The territory was still the kind of place where a man could vanish if he picked his ground, a country the law hadn't quite reached and the maps still drew in guesswork. And he'd been counting on that emptiness to do what a doctor couldn't. The valley was supposed to be empty, a square of nothing on the map between 2 ranges where a man could let his horse drink and his blood dry, and nobody would be the wiser. Which made the smoke a problem. A single gray thread rose from behind a stand of pine, too thin for a campfire and too steady for a careless one. Somebody lived there. Blaze's hand found the revolver on his hip the way a man's hand finds a railing in the dark. Not a decision, just the shape his caution took. He rode toward it slow, reading the ground the way he read every ground, and what he found didn't fit any picture he carried in his head. The cabin was old, logs gone silver with weather, the chinking patched in places with mud and in one place with a strip of rawhide that had held. Whoever built it had meant to stay, but it was the yard that stopped him. Out front, in rows straight as a rifle barrel, stood a garden unlike any homestead plot he'd ever seen. It wasn't beans and corn and a few scraggly greens scratched into the dirt. This was plotted with intention. Low herbs he couldn't name, beside taller ones he half recognized, each in its own place, like the whole patch had been measured with a string. A garden like that took years, and a kind of patience the frontier didn't reward. Under the lean-to sat a buckboard, the bed scarred and the boards bowed from real weight. A work wagon, not the kind of passenger carriage some city woman would roll up in. Whoever this was, they hauled their own loads, and they'd been doing it alone. He dismounted and walked the last 20 feet, boots quiet on the needle-covered ground. And he was already building the speech he'd give her, the one that had cleared 100 cabins before this one. Take what I need, leave you breathing, and no one has to die. The words sat ready in his throat, the way a round sits ready in the chamber, and he'd found over the years that most folks heard the first sentence and never needed the second. The door opened before he reached it, and the woman standing in the frame didn't match a single thing the valley had promised. She was small-framed, narrow through the shoulders, with jet black hair pinned in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her head, and not a strand loose. Her face was all sharp lines, high cheekbones, fair skin burned dark only across the tops of her cheeks, and eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the door. She wore a deep indigo kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat 2 sizes too large for her, the silk hem brushing the tops of worn leather boots. Nothing about her belonged in a Montana Territory valley, and she knew it, and she'd stayed anyway. That was the first wrong thing about her. He'd expected fear. He'd built a name on the expectation of it, and the name had saved his life more times than the gun. But this woman wasn't afraid. She looked once at his face, once at the dark stains spreading through his coat at the ribs, and stepped back from the door like he was a patient who'd kept her waiting. Blaze had robbed 100 cabins in his time, and the speech came out of him dry and practiced, the way a preacher recites a verse he no longer hears. He told her he'd take what he needed, food and horse feed and any coin in the house, and he'd be gone before dark, and she'd be alive when he left, which was more than most got. The revolver sat in his hand, steady, and he watched her face the way he watched every face, for the flinch that told him where the line was. He waited for it. The flinch didn't come. She didn't look at the gun. Her eyes went to his ribs again, to the way he was holding his weight off one side, and then she turned her back on him and crossed to the stove. A blackened kettle went on the iron plate, and she pulled a chair out from the table with her foot. "You sit down," she said, and the 3 words landed flat, no rise at the end, no invitation in them. "You will bleed to death before the sun is over the ridge if you stand there." Nobody had given Blaze an order in longer than he could remember. Men had begged him, and men had cursed him, and 1 or 2 had tried to outdraw him, but none of them had told him to sit down like he was a steer who'd wandered into the wrong pen. He stood in the doorway with the revolver up and the fever crawling up his neck, and the woman at the stove didn't turn around. She was grinding something in a small stone mortar, the pestle turning in a slow circle, and the sound of it filled the cabin the way a heartbeat fills a closed room. He put the gun away. He didn't decide it. His hand did it, the same hand that had decided to draw it, and he crossed to the chair and sat, and the sitting broke something open in his chest that had nothing to do with the wound. She worked without asking permission. From a shelf behind the stove, she lifted a lacquered box, dark wood fitted with brass hinges, and set it on the table between them. Inside, nested in red cloth, lay a row of needles so fine they caught the amber lantern light and threw it back as nothing. Beside them sat paper packets of dried herbs, each one folded and labeled in a hand he couldn't read, and a small cake of something that smelled like pine smoke and old earth. No explanation came with any of it. She lifted his arm, peeled the coat and shirt back from the wound, and looked at it the way a man looks at a broken harness he already knows how to mend. The wound was 2 days old, a long tear across the ribs where a rifle ball had grazed instead of buried, and the skin around it had gone the color of bad meat. A low sound came out of her, almost to herself, and she began to clean it with water she'd boiled and a clean cloth, and the pain of it pulled a grunt out of him he couldn't hold back. No apology came. She went on with the work. When she was done, she pressed a paste of the dried herbs against the wound, wrapped it tight with a strip of clean linen, and put the needles away unused. He reached for the pocket where he kept his coin, the few dollars a man on the run still carries, and slid them across the table toward her. He meant to pay her. She pushed them back, one motion, the back of her hand against the coins, and they rang against the wood and went still. The coins sat between them. Her eyes stayed on the tin basin where she was already washing her hands, and the refusal was so plain it took him a full breath to understand it. Nobody had refused his money. In years, nobody had refused him anything. He sat at her table with a fresh bandage around his ribs and the coins between them, and for the first time since the brother he couldn't save, he didn't know what to do with his hands. He didn't yet know that the woman who had refused him would cost him more than any man he'd ever drawn on, or that he'd pay it gladly before the week was out. Night came on fast the way it does in the mountains, and the valley went from gray to black in the time it took the kettle to sing. She poured him a cup of something bitter and dark that tasted like the floor of a forest, and she told him to drink it, and he did, because everything she told him to do so far had been right. The fever began to pull back inside an hour, not gone, but loosened, like a hand that had been gripping too long. The tea worked. He watched her move through the cabin the way he'd watch a man across a card table, learning the tells. Everything in the place had a place, and nothing was decorative. The herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, in an order he couldn't read, but she clearly could. The pots on the shelf arranged small to large. The floor swept to the grain. A person who lived like that had decided what mattered to them, and then built a room around the decision. And he'd been in enough rooms to know that most people on the frontier built theirs around a rifle and a bottle, and not much else. This room was built around something else. Above the door, mounted on 2 wooden pegs, hung a weapon he didn't recognize. A long pole with a curved blade at the end, the steel oiled and dark. It wasn't a rifle, and it wasn't a knife, but it sat in that high place the way a rifle sits above a rancher's door, kept close, kept ready. He filed it away and said nothing. The lantern on the table burned kerosene and threw a flickering amber light that moved across the walls like something alive. And in that moving light, he saw the one thing in the cabin that wasn't practical. A single photograph, small and faded, pinned above a low shelf. A courtyard with a tiled roof. A tree with leaves the shape of fans. And the corner of a building that looked older than anything the frontier had ever raised. He didn't ask about it. He read it the way he read the garden, as evidence of a place she'd left and hadn't stopped carrying. She spoke little, and when she did, the words came out pared down to the bone. He asked her, once, why a woman alone would pick a valley a full day's ride from the nearest town. And she didn't answer the question he'd asked. She answered a different one. The valley needed a healer, she told him. No one else wanted the cold. It wasn't an answer, and it was, and the gap between the two told him more than a speech would have. He let it sit. The wound reopened just past midnight. He felt it go, a warm spread under the bandage, and the fever surged back up his neck like a tide. She was across the room before he'd finished swearing, and this time she opened the lacquered box and took out the needles. She tore a small piece from the pine smoke cake and set it on the skin above his wrist, and then she lit it. The tiny cone of dried herb smoldered, a thread of smoke curling up, and a heat sank into the muscle that was nothing like the heat of the wound. It smelled like a field after rain, green and old at the same time, and the smell was the thing he'd remember years later when someone asked him what her medicine was. Not the needles, not the herbs, the smell. His whole arm went loose. The pain didn't vanish, but it stepped back, like a dog called off by a voice it knew, and the breath he'd been holding came out of him in a long shudder. She placed 3 of the fine needles, each one quick and certain, and he didn't feel them go in so much as he felt the tension under his skin release around them. His face must have shown what his mouth wouldn't, because she glanced up at him once, and the corner of her mouth moved in what might have been the first amusement he'd seen from her. He didn't smile back. "The fear comes first," she said, almost to herself. "Then the rest of it." He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected any of it, the garden, or the refusal, or the calm. And somewhere in the space between the needles and the smoke, he understood what he was looking at. It was not a woman stranded at the edge of the world. It was a craft, carried here on purpose, the way a man carries a coal through a storm to keep a fire alive somewhere it's allowed to burn. Something passed between them in that amber light. It was not love, not even trust, but a recognition. They were two people who'd both learned what it cost to stand alone against something bigger than themselves, and who'd both chosen to stand anyway, because standing was the only thing either of them knew how to do. The fever broke before dawn, and by the time the light came gray through the single window, Blaze knew he wasn't leaving. He didn't say it. He split the wood she'd been burning too green, the pile behind the lean-to gone down to kindling and wet pine, and he stacked a week's worth by the door before she'd finished boiling water for the morning. She watched him do it from the kitchen frame, and she didn't thank him, and she didn't tell him to stop, and that was its own kind of permission. Days folded into days. He mended the cracked axle on the buckboard, wedging a new pin of ash where the old one had sheared, until the bed sat level again for the first time in what looked like a season. And he repaired the lean-to's sagging roof and ran a trench around the garden so the spring melt wouldn't drown her rows. It was rancher's work, the kind his hands knew from a life before the warrant, and she let him do it the way a river lets a stone sit in its path, without comment and without moving it. His past came out in scraps, never a telling, just pieces that surfaced when the work pulled them loose. A warrant in 3 territories, and a name he'd taken because the one he was born with had died with a brother he couldn't pull out of a river. He'd never said that out loud before. The brother had been the steady one, the one who kept the books and paid the hands, and believed a man could raise cattle and raise a family in the same life. And the river had taken him in a spring flood Blaze had been 10 seconds too slow to stop. Blaze walked out of that water a different man, and spent the years since making sure no one ever got close enough to be 10 seconds too slow again. He'd built the fear on purpose, he told her once over the evening meal, because fear was cheaper than fighting, and a man who fights every challenger ends up dead or too tired to care which one comes first. She listened to that the way she listened to everything, with the stillness of someone weighing a thing she'd already weighed in her own hands. She understood walls. Her past came out in the gaps she left. She'd trained in the old ways under her grandmother, in a house with a tiled roof and a fan-leaved tree, before the new government in Japan decided the old medicine was backward and pushed it toward the door. She crossed the ocean alone. She didn't say why she couldn't go back, and he didn't push, because he knew the shape of a door a person had closed on purpose. A traveler came through on the 5th day, a freighter with a string of mules and a habit of talking that filled the valley like smoke. He saw the buckboard and the garden and the strange horse tied at the lean-to, and he asked 100 questions without asking any of them outright. The kind of man who collected weather reports and rumor in the same pocket. Blaze gave him coffee and short answers and watched him ride south toward the settlement. And as the man shrank down the trail, the valley felt smaller than it had that morning. Word was already traveling. She asked him about it that night. It wasn't about the traveler. She was asking about him. "Why are you still here?" she said, and the words came out flat. The way all her words came out, neither a question nor a challenge, just a thing she wanted set on the table between them. He turned the answer over for a long time before he gave it. A man in his line keeps a drawer full of lies for moments like this, hiding out, the horse needing rest, any of them ready to hand, and he could have pulled any one of them. He gave her the one that was true instead. "No one's coming up this road who means you harm," he said. "Not while I'm on it." It wasn't a promise of love. It was a promise of consequence, the kind a man like him had never made, because consequence had always pointed outward, away from anyone he'd chosen to keep. She looked at him after he said it, and she nodded once, and she went back to grinding herbs, and the cabin held a different shape after that. 2 weeks of that uneasy peace, and then the rider came back the way Blaze had known he would. The traveler had talked, the way travelers always talk, and talk in a territory travels faster than a man on a good horse. Word of a healer in the Wolf Creek Valley reached the spread down below, the ranch that ran most of the open graze and most of the debt in the country around it, and the ranch sent Hargrove. The valley had a boss. Hargrove came up the trail at mid-morning with 2 men behind him and a boy slung across a saddle, the boy's arm bent at an angle arms don't bend. The foreman was broad and sun-cracked, the kind of man hired to move herds and move people with the same flat efficiency. And he wasn't a monster, just a man with a hurt kid and a boss who paid him to fix problems. With the healer on the mountain, a problem that could also be a solution. He'd come to collect her. He tipped his hat when he dismounted, the politeness thin as paper. "We heard you set bones," he told her, not Blaze, his eyes already measuring the cabin and the garden and the buckboard. "Boy here got rolled by a steer. My boss would like to make an arrangement. Come down to the ranch, doctor the hands, live proper in the bunkhouse. Good wages and steady work." Kimiko looked at the boy on the saddle, at the arm, and she crossed to him and lifted the limb in both hands and felt it the way she'd felt Blaze's ribs, reading the break through her fingers. The boy bit down on a cry. She set the bone in one clean motion. The boy screamed once and then went white with relief, and she splinted it with strips of wood and a torn cloth, fast and sure, while Hargrove's men stood and watched a thing they couldn't have done with a whole toolbox. When the arm was wrapped, she wiped her hands on a cloth and looked at the foreman. "I treat anyone who comes to this door," she told him. "I don't go anywhere." Hargrove's face didn't change, but his weight did, settling a little deeper into his heels. He tried again. Reasonable. The wage, the roof, the company of other people, for a woman alone. And every word he said was a cage dressed up as a kindness. She gave him the same answer, the same quiet voice. And he ran out of reasonable. The answer didn't change. That was when Blaze stepped out of the lean-to's shadow. He'd been there the whole time, leaning on the post with his arms folded, letting her handle it, because she'd made it plain the first week that a man who stepped in front of her unasked would be asked to leave. But Hargrove had stopped asking her, and that was the line. The foreman knew the face. Blaze watched the recognition hit him, watched the name land in the man's chest like a stone dropped in a well, and the 2 riders behind Hargrove went still the way men go still when the math in a room changes suddenly. Blaze didn't draw. He didn't raise his voice. "The woman already gave you her answer," he told the foreman. Hargrove left with the boy and without the healer, and he rode south down the trail the way a man rides when he's going to report a failure to someone who doesn't tolerate them. Blaze stood in the yard and watched him go, and he knew what the man was carrying down that mountain. Not just the boy, but the name. And the name was the one thing he'd had left to trade, and he'd just spent it to keep a door closed. There was no taking it back. His anonymity was gone. The warrant and the boss were both coming now, and they'd come together. And the man who'd ridden into this valley to hide from both had just lit the fuse that would bring them to his door. Silas Vance ran the Wolf Creek Valley the way a man runs a clock, every gear answerable to the one above it, and at the top there was only him. He held the freight contract up the pass, the debt at the general store, and the loyalty of the 3 men who called themselves law in a territory that hadn't yet decided it needed any, which gave him the only real power for 60 miles in any direction. He wasn't a gunslinger. He was the system that had broken everyone who'd stood in front of him, the smith who'd moved into the ranch forge on Vance's terms, the farrier who'd signed over his tools for the price of a winter's feed, and the doctor, before Kimiko, who'd drunk himself to death in a back room Vance kept warm for him. His trade was owning people. Vance didn't come angry. He came reasonable, the way a man comes when he's never had to be anything else. He rode up on the 7th morning with 6 men strung behind him and a folded paper in his vest, and he dismounted in the yard like a man stepping onto a porch he already owned. He laid the paper on the table between them, a deed, the cabin and the 2 acres around it transferred to her name, free and clear. Beside it he set a figure, a salary, steady, more than a lone woman in a territory saw in a year. In exchange, her skills belonged to his outfit. The offer was clean on its face and a cage underneath, and she read it the way she read a wound, all the way to the bone. She gave him the same refusal she'd given the foreman, the same quiet voice, the words so even they could have been measured with a string. Vance didn't flinch. He'd expected the first no, and he'd built the offer to absorb it. So he turned to Blaze. He didn't reach for a gun. The hand went for the warrant instead, the name, the dead brother, the 3 territories that wanted the man standing in this yard, and he laid it out the way he'd laid out the deed, calm and itemized. A marshal sat in his pocket, he said, the kind of arrangement a man like Vance buys the way other men buy grain. Walk away, and the warrant stays cold. The marshal stays in his pocket, and the healer keeps her door, at least until the next reasonable man came up the mountain. Stay, and the marshal rides before the week is out, and the man who just spent his name to keep a door closed would spend his neck to keep it. It was the cleanest trap Blaze had ever seen, because every door in it opened onto something he'd built himself. Every man he'd killed to make the name had made the name into a leash someone else could hold, and the man holding it now had soft hands and a deed in his vest, and had never drawn on anyone in his life. The dark of his whole life sat on the table between them, and it was the first time he'd had to look at it whole. It was ugly. Kimiko watched him weigh it. She didn't beg, and she didn't look at Vance at all, but crossed to the shelf and lifted the lacquered box down and set it on the table next to the deed, and began to pack it, the needles into their cloth, the herbs into their packets, each piece in its old place. She wasn't leaving. She was ready, and that readiness was the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst a room can hold. And Blaze saw it, and the last hinge in his chest gave way. He told Vance to ride down the mountain before the sun moved. Dawn comes early in the high valleys, and it came that morning with riders on the ridge. Vance had said 8, and he'd brought 8, strung along the timberline against the pale sky, and behind them, somewhere down the trail, the promise of a marshal riding hard to collect a name. Blaze was still in the yard. He'd chosen in the dark, and the light found him standing at the corner of the cabin with his rifle up and the wound in his shoulder from a thing that didn't matter anymore bound tight under his coat. The first 3 came down the slope spread wide, the way men come who expect a cabin and a woman and not much else. He let them close to 40 paces, to the choke where the timber narrowed, and then he took the shot. The lead man's horse went down, and the man behind pulled hard left, and the third tried to come through the gap and found the gap was the one place Blaze had sighted the night before. 2 down in the first 10 seconds, and the valley woke up all at once. It had begun. He was good at this. He'd spent a life being good at it, and he hated that he was, and the hate didn't slow his hands. But the numbers were wrong, and he knew the math the way he knew the warrant, cold and final. By the time the next 2 pushed the lean-to from the far side, he'd taken the second wound, this one in the shoulder, high and messy, and his left arm went dead at the string. The rifle went to the right hand. He kept shooting, but the cabin was the only cover, and cover only holds for so long against 8. That was when the door opened behind him. Kimiko didn't hide. She took the long pole down from the pegs above the door, the curved blade catching the early light, and she stepped onto the porch in the indigo kimono with the blade low and her weight settled the way a person settles who learned to stand before she learned to run. 2 of Vance's men had made the porch while Blaze was bleeding, and they'd come expecting a woman crouched behind a door, and what they met was the edge of a thing her grandmother had called survival, not war. The first man went down before he raised his rifle. The second swung the stock at her, and she turned it on the shaft of the pole and put him in the dirt beside the first, and neither of them got up. Two men lay on the porch who'd thought a healer was the soft part of this house. And the men still standing in the yard began to do the math the living do when a plan goes wrong. Vance himself went for the box. He'd come for the asset, not the fight, and when the rifle and the blade broke his plan open, he did what a man who buys people does when the people stop being cheap. He moved to take what was portable. He was through the door and at the table with the lacquered box in his hands when Blaze came through behind him, one arm hanging and the revolver in the other. And the last exchange was the closest thing to a fair fight the whole valley had seen. 2 shots in a small room. One went wide into the wall. The other did not. Vance went down across the table, the box spilling from his hands, the needles and the herbs scattering across the wood, and the cabin went quiet except for the sound of Blaze's breathing and the slow settling of a man who wouldn't get up. Outside, the ones who could ride were riding, back up the timberline and gone, and the boy with the set arm wasn't among them. The shooting stopped. The valley held its breath, and then it let it go. The dead went down the mountain on the buckboard, carried by the 2 men who could still sit a saddle, and the yard emptied the way a yard empties when the thing that owned it stops owning it. Blaze's shoulder was bad, the ball still in there, the blood dark and slow, and he sat against the cabin wall and let her work on him the way he'd let her work that first night, only this time he didn't look away from her face while she did it. He trusted her now. She cleaned the wound, packed it with the same pine smoke herb, and wrapped it, and she refused the coins he didn't offer anymore. The cabin was half a ruin, the door off its pegs, a hole in the wall where the wide shot had gone through, and the lacquered box lay on its side on the table, with its contents spilled across the boards. She knelt to gather the needles and the packets, and when she righted the box, the bottom of it lifted, a false floor he'd never noticed in all the nights he'd watched her open it. The box had a secret. Inside the second compartment lay a bundle wrapped in red cloth, and inside the cloth sat a set of needles older than anything else in the cabin, the steel gone the color of dusk, the handles worn smooth by hands that weren't hers. Beneath them, a folded paper, cracked at the seams, with a seal he didn't recognize, and a single line of writing in a hand smaller and older than hers. She didn't translate it. She set it back and folded the cloth around the needles the way a person folds a letter they've read 1,000 times. She told him then, the only telling she gave. She hadn't been sent away, and she hadn't fled. She was the last of a line the new government in her country was letting die, and her grandmother had put the old needles in her hands and put her on a ship and told her to carry the medicine to the end of the earth, the one place no one had yet decided it was backward. The cabin in the cold valley wasn't a refuge. It was the last ground the old ways were allowed to stand on whole, and she'd held it alone because holding it alone was the point. Blaze understood then what he'd spent his name to protect. It was not a woman alone at the edge of the world. It was a thing the world was trying to end, kept upright by stubbornness in a valley nobody wanted. And he understood with the same cold clarity that he was the same kind of thing, a relic of a code the frontier was passing out of, kept alive by all the wrong means. He'd built a life on fear, and the fear had kept nothing worth keeping until the day a woman at a stove refused his money and told him to sit down. He didn't say any of it. He picked up the last of the scattered herbs and set them on the table beside the box, and she nodded once, and that was the whole of it. The marshal was still coming, if not this week, then the next, and the warrant had not burned with Vance. The law was still coming. Peace in the valley was real, and it was borrowed, and he knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He'd bought her ground with a name that would cost him the ground, and the only honest thing was to live on it while the days lasted, and to make the days count. The cabin stood at dusk, the naginata back above the door, the kerosene lantern lit amber in the window, and two people who'd chosen to stay moved inside its light while a marshal somewhere down the territory saddled a horse that wouldn't arrive today. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and if it moved you, hit that like button. The marshal is still writing.